Hi, my name's Jordan Marshall. I'm Special Projects Editor at Building Magazine. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second day of this iteration of Net Zero Live, and we've got a great presentation to kick things off. Our keynote for today is Will Arnold, Head of Climate Action at the Institution of Structural Engineers, and he's going to be talking to us all about an industry proposal for embodied carbon regulation in the UK, better known as Part Z. So Will is a fellow and staff member of the Institution of Structural Engineers, leading the institution's response to the climate emergency and embedding sustainability action into all aspects of its work. He's responsible for driving the update of minimum standards for institution members, producing supporting guidance, and leading collaboration across the wider industry. He also leads work on the Part Z initiative, chairs the CIC's 2050 group, and sits on the steering groups for both the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard and the Built Environment Carbon Database. So we're really lucky to have Will with us today. Before I hand over to him, just a little bit of housekeeping from me. The way today is going to run is I'm going to hand over to Will. He's going to run us through the proposal in a presentation, which will probably be the first half of today's discussion. But if you have any questions, please send those through anytime, and we will try and cover off as many of those as we can in the second half of the session. Secondly, this session will be available on demand. We always get that come through a lot of questions. People want to go back and review things, or they have a colleague who they think will really benefit from seeing it. Yes, it will be available on demand within about half an hour of the session finishing via the same link you've just joined by. So please feel free to review, share, it'll be there. That's probably it from me at this stage. So Will, I'll let you get on with things.
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, hi everyone. Pleasure to be here presenting to you this morning. So I'm going to sort of run through three things in roughly this order this morning. I'm going to talk about embodied carbon for those who maybe are sort of new to it, give you a sort of quick briefing on it, and for those of you who know about it, I'm afraid it'll just be a refresher, but I think it's worth us all being up at the same sort of starting point on this topic. And then I'm going to jump into Part Z, and I'm going to try and explain sort of why there's a need for this regulation in the view of myself and a lot of others in the industry. And then I'm going to explain what it is that Part Z itself is proposing within that. And I'm going to finish just by touching on the sort of timeliness of this and why now, what else is happening in the world and in the UK that would align itself with the need for this. So let's jump right in. So let's start by talking about why embodied carbon. And it comes down to this. So in the UK, about a quarter of our emissions from the country as a whole are from the built environment. So some of you might be more familiar with the sort of 40% number that you might have heard bandied around. That's a global figure. In the UK, we tend to sort of fly more, drive bigger cars, eat more meat, and consume more of the stuff. So the sort of built environment percentage shrinks a bit, but it's still significant, and it's still the biggest piece on most graphs that break down into different sectors. So it's about 180 million tonnes of carbon per year in the UK due to the built environment. And that gets split down into a couple of things. So we have this term whole life carbon, which is used to describe the total emissions throughout the entire life of a building or an asset, everything from constructing it in the first place through its life cycle, operating it, maintaining it, and so on. And at the end of life, when we come to demolish or deconstruct it. And whole life carbon is roughly split into two parts. So we have embodied carbon, which is obviously the focus of this talk, and then we have this other half is operational carbon, which has been the focus of a lot of conversations around carbon in the past. Now, the general rule of thumb is embodied carbon is anything that you can touch, and operational carbon is anything that is related to anything that you can turn on or off. So the chair that you're sat on right now, there are embodied carbon emissions associated with that chair. When the various materials were produced, there were greenhouse gas emissions emitted at that point in time. It was probably transported at some point, maybe transported between different factories, between the sort of padding being made somewhere and then transported somewhere else to be assembled into a full chair, and then obviously it's eventually transported to the position that you're sat in right now. There are emissions related to all of that. There's some maintenance that goes on to it through its life. Maybe less obvious with a chair, but maybe if you take the sort of window closest to you, maybe a bit more obvious that window might stay there for a long time, but might need certain parts replacing over its life cycle. And then obviously at the end of life of either of those things, their emissions do taking that away. And we use the term embodied carbon because effectively that chair or that window or whatever it is sort of the embodiment of those emissions. So it's not embedded. because there's no carbon dioxide embedded within it. These are emissions that were emitted during its construction and so on, but it's the embodiment, so we have embodied carbon. And then operational carbon is the parts that's left. And like I said, that's been the sort of focus of the conversation for quite a long time now. In the UK, for a typical mid-rise residential block, an office, school that meets current building regulations, the numbers stack up roughly in these sorts of proportions. So we have about a third of the whole life carbon emissions of a building such as that will be due to the embodied carbon, and 2/3 will be the operational carbon. And it just so happens that if you look at the UK as a whole, you sort of get similar numbers. So we spent, out of our built environment emissions in this country, about a third of those are due to constructing new buildings, new stuff. And the 2/3 are on heating and powering our existing building stock. So it's the same sort of rule of thumb, 1/3, 2/3. But that's all to do with what's typical today. And of course, where things are going looks more like this second graph. So we've got huge drive towards decarbonising our electricity grid in the UK. We've got regulation meaning that we're going to move away from gas pretty quickly. We've already got buildings being built with air source heat pumps instead, so electric only heating. And of course, as we design buildings that are maybe low energy, and we see a lot of exemplars of these out there at the moment as well, all of this squeezes the operational carbon piece, but it doesn't do very much to the embodied carbon side of things. The decarbonisation of the grid is obviously the exception to that, and it does make a bit of a difference to embodied carbon, but the biggest offenders in terms of embodied carbon emissions have other emissions that have nothing to do with electricity. So when you make concrete, there's a chemical reaction, and that's actually about half of the emissions due to concrete. So as such, we're moving towards this world where we have a much bigger problem that's this embodied carbon piece than what's left with the operational carbon piece. And at the moment, we expect that maybe by the end of this decade, by 2030, we would hope to be in a position, shown at the bottom, at least in terms of the grey bar, we'd hope that that's where we get to with operational carbon. Of course, the point of all of this is that at the moment we have all these different parts of the building regulations dealing with operational carbon and operational energy use. This is what's helping to drive some of those efficiencies and so on. And we have nothing at all to deal with the part on the other side of the graph with the embodied carbon. So it's completely unregulated, and it's currently the minority, although it's still a pretty big chunk. But by the end of this decade, it means that the majority of the emissions on new buildings will be unregulated. You can put as much concrete in the ground as you want. You can dig a hole to the center of the earth and fill it with concrete to build your foundations for your project. And as long as it doesn't, cut through any underground tubes or anything like that, that would be fine. That's clearly not quite okay. Hence me talking to you today. Just to sort of finish, to put some numbers on this, what we see is that the first point to note is that embodied carbon has not really changed in terms of UK emissions over the last 30 years. The dip that you see around 2010 was all to do with recession, and that's not to do with us building more efficiently, it's just due to us building less stuff in the UK. And the indication is that this number is rising again. So we're around the 50 million tonnes of carbon mark in the UK. And for comparison, that's more than aviation and shipping combined in this country, 50 million tonnes. So we've got, we've got these regulations out there and these policy ideas behind, aviation, for example. We've got the snappily named Jet Zero, but we have nothing to do with this 50 million tonne of carbon, elephants in the room called embodied carbon. The other thing I'd like to share in terms of numbers is just to sort of talk through the scale of emissions for sort of a few different things. Now, I'm not going to talk through all of these, but I just think it's worth sort of sharing these examples one at a time to give you a feeling of what the numbers look like at different scales. And you see that when you're down at the materials level, you're talking in terms of tons of carbon. Once you're up at a building level, it's between the hundreds and maybe tens of thousands of tons, depending on the size. A domestic family property is obviously going to be less than 100 tons. But by the time you get to a sort of city centre flagship development, you're going to be into the tens of thousands, if not more. You have whole developers' portfolios that get you into the hundreds of thousands of tons, and even probably the biggest buildings out there are in the hundreds of thousands of tons, if not more. In fact, I think from a rough back of fag packet calc, the Burj Khalifa is probably beyond 500,000, if not more, tons of carbon. And then yeah, at the top end of this scale, you've got the UK. So this is just to give you a sort of scale of where that all fits. So that's embodied carbon, and that's the sort of reason why I think there needs to be something regulatory around it. So I'd like to introduce what Part Z is, and the first thing I just want to sort of share is the authors who helped write this. So I just put these faces up to give you a feeling of the sort of breadth of experience that we have between us. We cover architecture, services, and structures. Plus, we have Yannick, who's sort of policy advice in terms of decarbonisation. Between us, we felt about a year ago that if anyone was going to have a shot at proposing some kind of sort of regulatory thing for this, we'd have as good a chance as anyone. So we got together to write what we thought a building regulation called Part Z might look like. And this slide just gives you a feeling of the sorts of work that we'd worked on together in the past up to this point. So we've authored all of these documents you see on the screen. So our plan was that if you want to get the industry talking about regulating embodied carbon, then maybe it'd be useful to give a working prototype of what it looks like to allow people to start to sort of unpick it and ask questions and comments. Obviously, the building regs is broken down into parts A, B, C, D, E, etc. Part L is for energy. We were going to name it Part Q, but then we discovered that was already being worked on by Department for Levelling Up, so we just skipped to the end of the alphabet. So it's called Part Z purely for simplicity, that no one else is going to ride to Part Z in the near term, we hope. And in the same way that the other parts have this sort of wording in Schedule 1 of the regulations, we wrote out the Part Z wording as it would sit in the regulation in our view. And it's got these two parts. So Part Z1 is basically to say that whole life carbon emissions need to be assessed and reported for the building and for any other parts of the project that the building regs apply. And then Part 2, and the wording's a bit funny, but that's because it's aligned with the Part L wording on this. Part 2 basically says that there needs to be limits on those carbon emissions, on the embodied carbon emissions. So the two parts, just to sort of recap that, the first bit is to talk about assessing and reporting, and the second part is about limiting. And I'll show you in a second, but they, in our view, are two different things and would come in at two different times. We've also suggested in Part Z that this would only apply to major projects. So projects with a GIA of more than 1,000 square meters, or that create more than 10 dwellings. So if you're working on a small housing development, or just a single property, or just a scout hall or something like that, this wouldn't apply to you in the first instance. And it's only applying on the scale of things where you're getting into the territory where you're doing the more onerous demands of Part L, the future home standard, and so on and so forth. And then our suggestion was that the first part of Part Z, the reporting side of things, kicks in as of next year. You can see obviously that first date's getting quite close now, and we will need to update our proposal at some point soon because it doesn't seem that's going to happen. And we've suggested that housing follows suit maybe a couple of years later. And the only reason for that is that in our experience as authors, the non-domestic market is probably slightly ahead of the curve on this topic. And we then said you'd collect data for a couple of years, use it to assess where you think benchmarks should sit, and you'd then set the limits based on that a couple of years later. So it wouldn't be until 2027 that limits would come in this proposal. And to supplement all of that, in the way that all parts do, we then pull together the sort of proposed document. It's not an approved document, it's not been approved yet, but our industry proposed document said, and that would explain to you how to go about doing this. I'm not going to open that on this screen. It's only got 7 pages to it. It takes about 5 minutes to read. It would be the shortest approved document out there if it was approved. But you can go onto our website, part-z.uk, and you can download it and have a look. And there's some commentary written alongside it so you can understand what we're doing. But in essence, what it tells you to do is to follow the RICS professional statements, which is more or less the de facto standard on this topic in the UK anyway. And it just draws out some of those pieces around size limitations and dates and things like that. It's fairly straightforward. And it doesn't have any carbon limits in it at the moment. because like we've said, you need to collect the data first before you can decide where to set those limits. The point of all of this is that there needs to be a clear policy ask from government that sends this sort of market signal. So in the same way that a few years ago, the government said we are not going to be allowing the sale of petrol and diesel cars in this country at all from 2035 and hybrid only from 2030, that sent a clear message to the market. And as a result of that, every advert you see on TV today for a car will have an electric engine in it because the industry has responded. So what we're asking for with this is similar, basically give clarity on what's coming and the industry will respond. So that kind of takes me on to the final piece of this, and that's just to reflect on some of the other things happening around the industry and some of the supporting reasons for why this is needed now. And the first thing to say on this is that the support that we've had for Part Z has been huge. This is a list of some of the names that are written in support of embodied carbon regulations. So we got in touch with some of these firms early on and said, we're going to put this Part Z proposal out there. We don't need your support of the proposal itself, but we would like to know whether or not you support the principle of embodied carbon regulation. And all of these firms and more have written in support of that, and they're on our website too. And you can see here some of the things that have been said by some pretty big household names, right? So Barrett Homes and JLL and NatWest and Stanhope and Landsec are pretty well known in this industry and beyond. And we're now up to nearly 200 of these statements, which is a pretty significant proportion of the building industry. The second sort of piece on timeliness, so we've got that industry support now, is just to point out that actually a lot of our European neighbours are doing this stuff already. So you can see from here, so on this graphic, the light grey is the point in time where the government said the policy was going to come in, and the black line and dark grey is then when reporting of whole life carbon was introduced. And the blue parts are where limits then came in, and as they ratcheted up. And you'll see from this that the Netherlands has been doing this for years now. France, Finland, and Denmark have all made this. You see the names on the screen. There's quite a few countries here that have made the commitment, and you'll see from the black lines that some of them have now introduced the reporting of whole life carbon. And I think the really important one on here, of course, is the EU as a whole, which you'll see at the bottom, is now debating how they could bring in by the end of this decade a requirement to report whole life carbon on all buildings. So there's a lot of progress on this, and you typically expect to see the UK at the front of something like this, I would have suggested, rather than lagging behind. So I feel like there's some catching up to do. There's also some movement amongst certain MPs who are supportive of this idea. So actually on this Friday of this week, Jerome Mayhew is going to be putting forward his private members bill, which is a carbon emissions buildings bill, which effectively asks for the same things as Part Z. We've been working with him on the details of that bill, and he's going to be presenting that in Parliament on its second reading. So that's the sort of formal debate of this. So this is the first time ever that this topic has got to this point in the Commons, and it's quite significant. Alongside all of that, industry is not waiting around for this to happen. And some of you may be aware of the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. This is a standard that's being written by these organisations at the bottom of the screen, with the help of about 300 volunteers from across industry. And effectively what this standard will do when it's launched is it will give a voluntary standard that clients can put into their briefs for their design teams and so on, that says to them that this is how we want you to define net zero for the building that you're going to produce for us. And that will include, in the same way that Part Z asks for it, will include the requirement to report embodied carbon alongside operational, and it will set limits on that. And that will be launched in the middle of next year, so look out for that. So the industry is not hanging around. And then even when you go beyond that sort of core of the industry, you look at the house building industry, and you've got the Future Homes Hub. They're working up roadmaps, route maps, and sort of delivery plans for the rest of this decade. That includes nods towards things such as embodied carbon limits and embodied carbon regulation, and actually even within the UK government's construction playbook, which is the sort of requirements for public projects, even that now requires whole life carbon reporting on projects. The thing, of course, that's missing is it's missing any sort of consistency of how you go about reporting it, which is causing headaches and means that we're wasting time and money by doing different things on different projects. Hence the need for something like Part Z. But the point is that even our government is aligned in this and is going in that direction. And to me, this is all a case of when now rather than if. So you see from the precedent, you see from the industry readiness, the industry asks, the fact that we've got all the tools we need. This will be coming in within years, hopefully, and hopefully you know from talking at events like this, it gives the industry a chance to learn about Part Z and what's coming in. Hopefully you feel a bit more prepared for it when it does come as a result. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you for listening to that. And Jordan, back over to you.
That was such a great overview, and we've already got a number of questions coming in. One that we have had come in a couple of times that I think I can answer, but I just want to make sure that I'm right. People are asking to view the document. It's just on the website that you were describing, right? So I'll send that out to that web link out to the audience now. So that's in the chat for all our attendees. And you'll be able to see that now and go there, download that. You said it was 7 pages, and that should be great. Okay, so we're going to start trying to get through some of these questions. I have to admit, some of them are very technical, so I'm sure that's fine for you, but for me, it is more of a challenge. But one of the ones that we have had come in a couple of times is around measurement and like what the measurement method would be for like meeting that Part Z standard and how that would work. Would you be able to give like a sort of quick summary on how that might work?
Yeah, no problem. So, I mean, in essence, we already have a measurement standard in the UK. So we have this thing called the RICS Professional Statements. To give it its full title, it's Professional Statements on Whole Life Carbon Assessment for the Built Environment. That's existed since 2017. That's now 5 years old. It's actually being updated at the moment, and a new version will be coming out next year, which adds in, you know, additional thinking that's happened in the last 5 years onto version 2. So in essence, Part Z just refers straight to that. It says to use that because that's what everyone is using. If you're new to this sort of topic in this area, then it can be quite confusing sometimes because it sounds like there's all these different tools and methodologies, but they all kind of sit underneath each other. So you've got some Eurocodes on this topic. So EN 15978 is the one that everyone knows about, catchy title. The RICS Professional Statement is the sort of how-to guide that tells you how to do that. And then underneath that, you've got this level of tools and guidance and stuff that you can download from different websites. So they all go through the same thing, and Part Z is just feeding into that same ecosystem.
Absolutely. You did touch on this in your presentation, but obviously there's that Jan 2023 date that you said will probably need to be adjusted, given that we're now pretty much December 2022. Do you have any sort of guidance on what that might look like in terms of how much that might move?
At this time, we haven't really decided. The thing I'd say is that so the private members bill that we've been working on with Jerome, that's going to have a date in it of the end of 2023, so December of next year. But that's for the first stage, which is reporting for non-domestic properties. Everything else in it stays the same. The principle that we've always worked to on this is one that, you know, government probably needs to give the industry about a year's head start before requiring the reporting. But even then, the reporting can be something that we get better at as we go along. And it's the limiting that's a really sort of hard line date. And you see from that sort of steps approach we took that it's not till 2027 that we're suggesting that limits would come in anyway, which is still a good sort of 3-4 years away. So yeah, a bit of an unknown what we're going to say. We need to have a discussion over the next month or so, but hopefully still sometime next year is what we'll be proposing.
Absolutely. So then another one of the ones we've had come in, obviously you've talked about the private members bill, which shows there is the government support there, because that has to have a certain amount of backing to, you know, get to where it is in itself. But do you feel there is good government support for a Part Z? Do you feel like the proposals are being well received?
I think that, I mean, from what I've seen, governments are still cautious about this topic. They don't like to regulate before they feel that they have to on anything, from what we've seen. So we know that governments are aware of this. We know that DLUC are fully aware of Part Z. They're aware of the industry support that's out there for it. And we know that they are going to conduct a formal consultation on embodied carbon regulation next year. So that's really positive, and it is moving in the right direction. Beyond that, we don't know what their plans are. And, you know, why would we? We're industry. We're not, you know, we're not civil servants.
No, absolutely. So we've had a sort of question about proving compliance. So, with most parts of the building regulations, you can prove compliance upon completion of stage 5 or practical completion. Is that when the whole life emissions will be predicted, and sort of how accurate can that be? Or will compliance come later down the track?
So I guess there's two things to say on this. So the first is we've aligned with Part L in terms of reporting. So with both Part Z and Part L, you would report your sort of predicted emissions prior to starting on site to get your permit to go ahead and start building. And then you then update that at practical completion to demonstrate what was actually delivered. So we're aligned with Part L for that. In terms of then limits that you're trying to meet, what we've suggested is that to start with, these would only be upfront carbon limits, not whole life. So the limits are only on the emissions due to the construction, everything up to practical completion. And that's really it's kind of twofold. One, it avoids getting into the weeds about the sort of prediction side of things for all of your in-use carbon. So, how often will my windows be replaced and stuff like that is all a bit of a prediction. Just avoids that altogether for now, to start with at least. And the second thing, of course, that it does is it allows you to measure what was actually delivered to site. And you can ask for environmental product declarations from your material suppliers, which is sort of carbon data sheet for those materials. And that allows you to report what's actually been built. So that's what we've suggested we start with. Of course, all of this would be open to industry consultation, and some people feel that that's not ambitious enough, and it should be whole life carbon targets brought in as of next year. Of course, there'll always be different opinions on it.
No, absolutely. We've also had, so obviously this standard, and correct me if I'm wrong, would be developed for England. And so we've had a couple of questions coming in about different devolved nations and whether you are aware of any similar standards being developed in those spaces.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure I do. Yannick Giescombe, who's on our authors team, is based up in Scotland, and has helped do some bits of policy work around that in the past. We know that Scotland has got its own sort of net zero standard that it's been working on as well, but we haven't. We're not aware of a Part Z Scotland being developed, for example.
Okay. And then there's also been some questions around, in terms of this obviously proposal that you're looking to get through into make it an actual approved document. But in the meantime, if we want to drive, industry to start already adopting some of these principles, are there things that clients, whether they're public sector clients or private sector clients, can be doing to help embed these practices in their projects?
Yeah, there is. So I guess the next big thing that's going to happen is in the middle of next year when the standard is released that I mentioned, so the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. And if you go online to what would you go to? nzcbuildings.co.uk. Then you can read more about that, and there's videos and PDFs and stuff like that about it. That would be, once that's launched, that will become the sort of in the same way that a client can currently reference BREEAM when they're trying to set sustainability ambition for their project, they would be able to reference that standard and set that as part of the brief. And so once it's launched, I'd encourage as many project teams and clients and developers as possible to reference that, because that will get people moving in the same direction. In the meantime, I would suggest trying to set carbon targets on your projects. Always a good place to start. Look at what the works of Letty and the RIBA have put out there in terms of those. And get familiar with the RIC special statement, because that will be the sort of the standard that we'll all be using in the future.
Bro, so we've had another question come in about the idea that non-traditional methods of construction are becoming increasingly commonplace, and within those, that a lot more of those increasingly have the ability to be deconstructed and then reused. So how does that sort of work, and will Part Z account for that, for non-traditional construction methods?
So yeah, I mean, we're sort of material agnostic in a way. What Part Z's asking for is a performance level to be set in terms of the emissions due to whatever it is you use to build something out of. And the quickest way to meet any carbon limits or embodied carbon limits will always be to prioritise the reuse of what's already there. And if you can't reuse something that's already there, then try and use reused materials that are coming from elsewhere. And if you can't do that, then prioritize the lowest carbon materials for the job that you're working on. And that's always, the sort of the hierarchy in terms of materials. You've then obviously got fission configurations and things like that too. So the how you go about achieving the regulation, we don't write into that deliberately. We're just trying to set the sort of limits. I think that's what's missing at the moment is we don't have consistent limits, and we don't have a consistent methodology that everyone's being told to follow to meet those limits. Once we've got those, you then free up design teams to go about meeting them in whatever way makes the most sense for the project that they're on.
Yeah, so there won't be prescriptive, prescriptive ways you have to meet it, but there will just be an end target you have to meet to make sure.
Yeah.
Bro. We've had a couple of questions come in as well about obviously the building safety conversation is another significant one for the industry at the moment, which has tended to steer designers towards high carbon materials like concrete and steel to move away from combustibles in some particular building types and circumstances. And so how do people go about responding to this to ensure that you can balance the two so that you're not just focusing on one and ignoring the other?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously our buildings have to be safe. I mean, that just should be able to go without saying. But the thing that sometimes does seem to happen without saying is our buildings also need to be sustainable and low carbon and moving us towards, the UK's legal commitments in terms of its decarbonisation strategy. So you have to be able to do both at once. Regulation on this is never going to be the gold standard. It would always be the sort of minimum standard, because if you don't meet it, that's illegal. You're breaking the law. And so what we would anticipate is that when limits come in on the first day, they'd be set at the sort of place where, a fraction of the total building stock would have failed the year before. So it might be set at the point where 95% of things pass on day one when the limits come in. And on the remaining 5% of things, you need to go about making things a bit better to get that carbon footprint down a little bit. The point, of course, is that you can then ratchet this over time, because once you introduce this mechanism, you can then say, well, 3 years' time, we're going to make the limits 10% lower, 15% lower, whatever it is. I think what we see today is the problem is not so much that concrete and steel are being used for projects. The problem is that they're being used poorly or inefficiently. We have construction methodologies that mean that we just use a lot more material than we need to, and a lot of it's driven by cost. In the UK, it's cheaper to pour extra concrete than it is to hire some extra people to sort of make your concrete shape more refined, and therefore more efficient. And that needs to change, because we need to treat materials as a sort of scarce resource, or a resource that we're precious about how we use. So I don't think that something like Part Z is going to have a significant change to the palette of materials that we're going to be seeing being used in the first instance. But what it will do is, of course, it will provide a real incentive for people to consider which material is best in which situation. It will provide a real incentive for those sort of R&D labs around the world that are trying to decarbonize materials, and all of a sudden there'll be a much stronger market pull for green versions of materials, and so we should see more investment into R&D and things like that. And it will start to evolve the materials industry in the right direction. But now on day one, it's not just going to say, everything has to be built out of bamboo and timber, otherwise it won't meet the standard.
Yeah, fair. So one of the other questions we've had come in, obviously you mentioned the different implementations for non-domestic and domestic buildings, but will there be different targets for different types of projects and typologies, or will there be like a sort of set standard?
So, I mean, we haven't specified anything in our proposal, and the reason why is because that should be a decision that's driven by the data that comes in. So at the moment on the net zero carbon building standard, we're in the process of collecting data from people. And actually, I should say now that if any of you have embodied carbon data for projects that you'd like to share with the standard, please go to nzcbuildings.co.uk and give it to us, because we're kind of going through the same process that Part Z will go through in the future. Once you've got the data, you can then make a decision. And I know that I think it's in Denmark, they concluded that they were just going to set the same carbon footprint limit for all buildings, which I think was in the region of something like 600 kilograms of carbon per square meter, because they just said, well, that is probably good enough. It doesn't change too much between typologies. But yeah, you could imagine us ending up in a position where we say that, your sort of domestic house building has one limit, your flats, apartment blocks different, commercial's different again, and everything else has something else. So, or it could be more granular, but I think it will come down to what the data shows and how much granularity we have as to what kind of granularity you can set on the limits.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for a couple more questions, so I'll try and just squeeze a couple more in before we have to wrap up. We've got one about how do you propose we authenticate EPDs to ensure that embodied carbon numbers in construction are accurate?
So, I mean, my understanding is that EPDs are already third-party verified, and that therefore we should be able to sort of rely on them. But it's a fairly new field, isn't it? So it's something that's only going to get better over time. We're going to get more of them. They're going to get more accurate, and we're going to see more and more scrutiny as different companies point fingers at each other and say, "Well, hang on, that doesn't make sense." So I think that their reliability should increase over time.
Sorry, we've just had a couple of requests come in. Could you repeat that website that's used to submit the EC data?
Sure.
Just so
if I put in the chat to you as well, then you can.
I can pop it out to the audience. Yeah.
There's nzcbuildings.co.uk.
Cool.
Or if you just search net zero carbon building standard, it should come up as well.
That is in everybody's chats now, so you should all have it. That's great. We've already had a few people who obviously are keen to contribute. So
right.
That's. I'm very conscious that we don't have very long left and we've covered a lot of ground. So I was sort of wondering if you might be able to run through a couple of key takeaways that you'd love people to sort of like leave the conversation with today, just to make sure that we've hit all the key points and everyone's leaving with the top of mind things.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the key points around Part Z are, of course, that this is it's an industry proposal. This is industry calling for this. I think that the 200 statements on the website speaks for itself in how much industry would like to see this happen. And if you read those statements, you'll see that it's because they want this level playing field and this consistency to help them do their job better. What we've proposed is a proof of concept, no more than that. But we are always interested in what people think of it. So do get in touch if you've got comments you'd like to make on it. What I'd ask of you as audience members would be to have a look to see if your company is already writing in support of this. And if they're not, see if you can get that conversation to happen. There's a form on our website that you can fill in if you are in support of it, and you can see the sorts of statements that others have written if you need some inspiration. And then really just to then, back onto the NZC building standard, that's going to be the sort of interim thing that comes in the meantime till this is regulated. So, check that out as well. And it's really good bit of work being done across industry.
Brilliant. I'm sorry to anyone whose questions we didn't get to. There was a lot more than could be answered. I will make sure they are the ones that are expressing interest in different things. I'll make sure they're passed along to Will so that he's aware of that sort of thing. But as Will said, make sure you check out those links. Make sure that you look at the resources available because there's plenty of stuff going on that is really great. The one that I can answer that we've had through, yes, you can share this with colleagues. You can use the link that you joined by today. It's being recorded. It'll be available probably by about 10:30. So please do. The more people who know about these sorts of initiatives, the better. So Will, thank you so much for your expertise and your time today. We really appreciate it. It was a great addition to the Net Zero calendar from our perspective, and we're really grateful to you. Finally, we have a 30-second survey that will pop up when this closes, just to make sure that we're covering the topics that you guys want us to be covering in these sorts of sessions, to find out, your favorite format for events and that sort of thing. So anybody who has 30 seconds to fill that in, we'd be so grateful. Also, please check out the rest of the sessions today. We've got one at 11 and one at 2 o'clock. The next one is on actually Part L, so probably follows on quite nicely. If everyone has a great day, that'd be great. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.